you see all the details.
Okay, am I back?
Control minus. We'll zoom it down so you can see the whole thing. And here you can check things like the alpha channel.
Alright, I can't show any other, like, video stuff, because apparently it'll
comes up in a little QuickTime
keep
player.
knocking it down. Anyway. So if you look up Fatty Boom Boom from Die Antwood,
It brings up
it-
music in After Effects.
it'll show the big white text. Okay, we got through that.
There's no reason to do this with audio. There's no
Alright,
way to
and then
check as
from
far as
there,
any kind of video information
I think
goes.
if I
It's
go
a feature.
just to... Let me
Okay,
check.
let's
If
go
I
look at
just
the
do
window.
Google Images,
Alright, the small box of tools up here is the toolbox.
please.
Most of these tools are grayed out right now because we don't have a composition open. We don't have
Okay,
any
so
elements to
picture-
manipulate. But I just want to point out real quick what the different tools are. You'll do most of your manipulation with the arrow tool, which is what's selected right now. Just to the right of that is a little arrow going in a circle. That's the rotate tool.
Cartoon, come on.
The rectangle
Come
underneath
on,
the
my
arrow
guy.
tool is a masking tool. Creates rectangular masks so that you can crop stuff.
Alright. So
Just to the
picture,
right of
like,
that is an oval mask.
It's not 4K, but it's
is
normal
for creating
1080 by
masked shapes
9
that, are irregular,
1920.
or for editing motion. To the right of that, you have the anchor
And so it's
point
doing that, it's really spastic, blah blah
I'll
blah,
explain that
and then it
more
just
in-depth
snaps to black.
and a couple of other
And then
graphics
from
tools
there,
that show up a lot
if
of
you
them.
look up
There's the
Dr.
hand tool, which lets
Katz,
you pan around
it
inside the
will
window, and
start
zoom in, zoom
with,
out tool. All of these
it'll
tools
start
have
with
keyboard
the,
shortcuts.
let's see
The
here.
letter Q gets you the arrow.
God, the
key.
building's gotta be
Letter W
somewhere.
gets you the rotate tool. These two don't seem to make sense as far as the letters meaning anything, but they are conveniently located right next to each other on the.
So it shows the outside of the building. It's just like how
The
it
rectangle
usually
mask is the
goes
C key.
before he talks
Oval
to
mask is the letter V
a
for
client.
circle. The pen tool is the letter G. The letter Y will get you the
That's-
anchor point editor. The hand tool.
That's
is the letter
crazy
H.
how there's,
Thank goodness something
and
is the letter
and so
H.
from
And the
there,
magnifying glass.
the
is
glue
letter Z.
that is going to hold this
That keeps
together
you-
is me basically
Now, the
being
time
in
control panel,
a
basically operates like the
therapy
VCR
session
when you have a composition
talking
you're
about
working the composition
my
at the
resume.
time, you have the
So,
option of using the time
it's,
control panel here.
almost
So
meta on
play
meta.
at a frame at a time.
By the way, the
Move to
voice
first
of
frame,
Dr.
the
Katz's
last
son
frame,
is
or
Ben,
jog and shuttle around.
who is the voice of Coach McGurk on Home
There are
Movies,
keyboard
who is the
commands for
voice
all
of
these
Bob
types
from
of
Bob's
tools, and
Burgers.
there are a lot more
Fun
than
fact.
I find than mousing around up
So
here.
anyway,
I
it'll
tend to
do, if you
recommend
look up the beginning of Dr. Katz and how
shortcuts.
I was able to find a plugin that makes it all squiggly, the characters. I'm not gonna show any video because I don't wanna disconnect anymore. So whenever there's like a Dr. Katz talking, there's stuff that I might add into it. And of course, I redrew all of the backgrounds, so I'm not copying, pasting the actual screenshots of the show. I actually basically did kind of a semi-rotoscope trace of it, and then I did some filters to have it a little bit more pixely and have it a little bit more blurry. I'm very happy on how it turned out, but in a way you can also tell that I made it because it's not perfect. So there's some of that in between that I haven't done fully, because that's towards the end kind of. And so it's from there, and then we're talking. I don't know what kind of way we are talking.
Files or otherwise messed around with project. Let's go to the file menu and pick revert to
But we are
project.
either going to,
Comes up back to their
it's more of like an introduction
Okay. Once
or
it's back to
something
its
like,
old
how are you
green
doing,
self,
blah, blah, blah.
create a new
And
composition
then
by picking
something.
new composition
So like
from the composition window.
saying,
Or you can hit Control N
how are you
on the keyboard.
doing?
Let's name the comp First Try. Let's change the size to
We
320 by 240,
were
which for some
talking
reason is
about
large. Square pixels is fine. Keep the
when
resolution.
we
Set the frame rate
last
to 15 frames a
left
second,
off.
and the duration to 4
Um,
seconds. Hit OK.
Or
All right. Now let's look at the composition
so
window.
it
This is
sounds
the stage
like
where you
that. It
position
sounds
your elements and you animate
like
them. You
you
have as many comps as you
want
in the project,
to
and each comp can have a unique name, length, size,
and then like
resolution,
professor
frame
spot
rate,
blah blah
pixel
blah.
aspect ratio. Because comps can be so unique, each comp will have
Let me
its
get
own
rid of the
associated
first
timeline window.
part.
Now, these two are connected together, but sometimes you might
So
accidentally
we were
split
talking
one,
about.
by mistake. So the way to get it back
So it sounds
is to
like.
just click the little square box that you see.
So
and
how
push it back.
was?
That works both ways.
Now
For some reason
I'm
you
gonna
close
try
the
my
side,
best to make sure that since I'm
close
talking,
there, and it brings the comp window.
I'm writing for both.
Now, if you ever
That it
decide
doesn't
to
seem
change the
like
settings of a composition once you've created
it's
it, there are a
me
number of
talking
ways
to
do it.
me,
If you like playing around
even
with
though it
the mouse, you
is.
just click on the name of the comp there, and it brings up the composition settings. And you can
So
change it.
let's.
If you like keyboard shortcuts,
So how was?
does the
Yeah.
same thing.
So how was your
If you can't
weekend?
remember either of those, up under the composition menu, composition settings,
And then
will bring up the same box.
I'll
Now,
make
if you
it
just need to change the name
DK for Dr.
of the comp,
Katz.
you just select it in the project window, highlight it, hit the return key, and type in
Keyboard's
the name.
all messed up.
Now that we have
Yo.
a comp, we need to add some footage to it. So select the cloud pics from the project window.
It was
Drag it
good.
into the comp. Now, Cloud Pix is the same size as the comp, so it snaps right into place, filling the window.
Or what? You couldn't hear me or something? I'm not sure what you
All right, in our timeline,
said or
hit the
meant.
space bar, or you can push the play button
So,
on the smart controllers if you've left.
How's?
And watch the clouds roll by for a second.
So how was your
Push
weekend?
spacebar
There.
again to
How
stop it.
was your
Hit it again to
weekend?
start it. You can watch the progress of the timeline
Pretty-
here in the timeline window.
All right, we're just
Now,
gonna
if the movie
start
plays at
throwing
the end
stuff
of the
out.
timeline, the screen will
Pretty
go gray.
good.
Just hit the space bar again, and it'll start the movie again from the beginning. And stop it after a second.
Should I say
Let's add
something
another
I
image.
did,
Let's go
or
to
should I
text
not?
and add neat stuff. In fact, let's use
Pretty
neat
good.
stuff to illustrate a couple of different
Maybe.
ways that you can add footage to a comp.
And then I'm gonna have like
You can drag it straight to the timeline.
close up of him,
Timeline happened to be closer. Control Z, which is the undo shortcut.
medium,
You can pick neat stuff
Dr. Katz,
in the project window a little bit wider. And drag neat
close,
stuff
medium,
to the comp in the project
me.
window.
Pretty
In both of
good.
those cases, it will show up centered in the composition.
Pretty good. I blah blah blah.
The delete key. It's another way
Pretty
to
good.
do that also.
Something
Or
I
you
would
can
have
select
done,
Neat stuff.
but really
And
quick.
hit Control / and that also
Pretty
adds it
good.
into the center of a comp. These last two ways of adding footage
Something.
are faster, but dragging the element directly into the composition is the only way to position it precisely. So let's drag it on. in.
You?
Now this
And
element is
then-
smaller than the composition, but notice that it still snaps to the center. In fact, it also snaps
Not
to the
really
sides of the comp,
about
the
me,
top and the bottom, and the corners.
but it was good.
Drag it to the center and let it go. Now if you click and drag it again, you'll see it's not snapping anymore.
Awesome.
So now you can really precisely line things up. But if you need to make it snap again, holding down the Shift and Alt
So,
keys as you drag,
we
will force it back into
were
snap mode.
talking about
Again, back to the
your
corners, etc.
future
Like many other graphic programs, if you hold down the Shift key while you're
ambitions
moving something,
as a
it strange the motion into the vertical and
professor.
horizontal. For the time being, let's drag neat stuff up just a tad into the
Let's
top half
see.
of the screen.
Pretty
Now,
good.
if you look down here
Something.
at the timeline, you'll see
You?
the two elements
Yeah,
that
still
we drug in. We brought the clouds in
continuous,
first, so they're at the bottom.
medium me.
Every element that you bring into a comp is a layer, and you can have as many layers as your computer's RAM will accommodate.
Should it be
Every layer
close
has a
up?
gray time bar that indicates where in the composition
No,
it
we're gonna
starts
do-
and stops. The numbers at the top of the timeline.
We're gonna do
indicate where
another
you are
medium.
time-wise. 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, 4 second.
And then close
Follow
up.
my direction so far,
of
you'll
me.
notice that neat stuff's layer seems to start
We're still gonna.
a little bit
So we were talking
after
about
the
your
cloud
future
layer.
ambitions
Well, that's
as
because
a.
an element's in point in time
Medium.
is set to wherever the blue time marker is when you drag it in. This is one of the most common little mistakes in After Effects, to accidentally drag in an element at the wrong time. It's a very
Let's
easy
see.
thing to fix. The easiest thing to do is to just grab the gray bar in the middle and slide the element Over to the left, if you hold the shift key down, it snaps
medium
the
me?
first frame,
Should it
and
be?
you can let it go.
Should I be on every single one?
Notice also that this
Like when they
profile
talk,
is
should never
still
be
is
overlapped.
set with a duration
Like
that is equal
it's
to the
on
length of the
Dr.
comp.
Katz,
The
but
cloud
I'm
activity, on the
talking
other hand, is 10
kind of
seconds.
deal.
So in a 4-second comp, the
Should I
back-end
do
cloud
something
loop
like
runs
that,
off the
or
timeline. Up in the comp window, we consider the layers to be stacked from back to front.
let's
In the timeline window, it goes from bottom to top. If you click and drag Neat Stuff's name below the cloud movie, it will go behind the clouds, and you can't see it in the comp window.
hold on for one
Drag
second.
it back up to the top, and Neat Stuff comes back to the front. Or drag the cloud movie behind it, and things pop back where they were. Now make sure that you grab the layer's name, not the gray bar. If you try to drag the gray bar, well, you can't reorder layers that way, but you are likely to accidentally move your layer forward and backwards in time and screw up your animation. All right, let's add action to our
Let's see
scene.
here.
It's up here in the text. Drag it in and position it so that it just overlaps Neat Stuff. Now, Actions layer shows up at the top of the list here in the timeline. There are now 3 items
Okay.
there. If you want to select any
We'll try
layer,
that.
of course, you can click on its
Okay.
name. But
So
there's
we're
a
talking
number
about
of
future
names,
ambitions as professor. Yes.
and if you type those
So,
numbers over on the numeric keypad,
where
that will also
did
select the layer.
these
Well, it only works for the top 9 layers.
thoughts come from?
Click somewhere empty to deselect everything, or you can use the tab key. And you can also select things by clicking on them directly.
Where
in
these
the pop-up.
thoughts first come from?
Again, click somewhere empty, in this case in the pasteboard, to deselect. Holding down the shift key lets you add things to a selection and then subtract them again. And there's a little quirk about
Okay.
selecting things. If you select something first that covers an
So where are
entire
these?
composition like this, and then try to select something in front of it, After Effects doesn't let you do it.
Actually,
There's a reason for this. Often
I'm
you get
gonna do
multi-layers
the
that are all
storyboard
the
thing
same size.
right when I'm
Once you've selected
done with this
something,
little talk.
you want to be able to
Actually
manipulate it.
wanted to be an
So once
animator
it's selected, After Effects assumes that you
first.
want to drag it around. Well, if you don't, if you just want to deselect it and select something else, again, hold the Shift key down to deselect it, then click again to select. Shift to deselect, Shift to select again. Alright, Action should still be positioned slightly over Neat Stuff. Now with Action selected, use the Control key and the up-down arrow keys to move
Okay.
layers backwards and forwards layer-wise in the composition. Watch the layer's name in the timeline
Never-
to see what I mean.
Never saw myself as good. No.
Another shortcut, if you have a whole bunch of layers, is Control B will send something all the way to the back.
Yeah, we're gonna go from.
Control F will bring it all the way to the front of a comp. Alright, make sure Action is back in the front. Okay,
I first
now click and drag and
I
then hold the Shift key
first
down to constrain its motion.
got
Drag it down so it's in center
Inspired
of the bottom half of the comp.
from
Now
a
notice you can tell when a layer is selected by the 8
From
squares
a-
that appear around it. Plus, there's a little
for a
circle
piece
with an X in the center.
in
The
the
squares are handles
animation
that allow you to
show
resize the
DVD,
layer. If you drag the handles on the side, it
and
resizes
then
in only one
DVD
dimension. And if you drag the
case
handles on
thrown
the corner, you can resize it in 2 dimensions
on
simultaneously,
disc
including turning it inside out.
2.
Click and drag and then hold the
I don't
Shift
know
key
if
down and
it's
it'll
on a
constrain the
disc.
aspect ratio to its original proportion.
I mean, I don't know what
Always
disc it
remember to
is.
Click first, then hold the Shift key down, or you deselect it. Double click on the pointer tool
On disc
to
2.
reset a layer to its original size. Now let's repeat what just went on there. If you hold the Shift
Let's
key down
have-
first and then try to grab
do
a corner
that
box to resize something.
Same time.
Well, remember we were just talking about the Shift key selecting
Disc
and deselecting.
thrown.
If you want to resize something proportionally, click
And
the
I
box
do
in
it
the corner
up,
first, then hold
same
down the Shift key.
time.
Gonna play with resizing things again, only this time
Okay.
we'll hold down the Alt key as we're dragging things. Now, depending on the speed of your machine, with the Alt key held down, you can see things as you're manipulating.
This
It's not really a real-time preview, but the faster your machine, the faster this preview will be. And even on a slow machine, this can be very, very useful.
Okay, now it's gonna be back to Dr. Katz.
Anything that can be adjusted with the mouse in After Effects. A slider, the rotation, the scale, the opacity, all of these things, if you use the Alt key in conjunction with the controls, you'll be able to see a preview of what you're manipulating as quickly as the computer
Short
can get it to real time.
by Don
Click again
Hertz.
to bring it back to 100%.
Felt.
Select the Rotate tool and rotate your object. If you Alt-rotate it,
Let's see.
once again, you can
The
see it
animation show DVD
Now,
1.
if you add the Shift key to that, it constrains the rotation
We'll see
to 45
what.
degree angles. And if you double-click on the Rotate tool, it brings things back to their original settings. Now, since most of the manipulation
Was this volume
of any
1?
given layer happens with one of these two tools, it's a good thing to know, again, that the keyboard shortcut
Show
to toggle
volume
between these
1.
two also happen to be right next to each other on the keyboard. They're the Q key, which gives you the arrow, and the W key
DVD
gives you the
2.
Rotate tool. There are
Or
keyboard
disc 2 or
shortcuts
volume
to
2?
move, rotate, and scale things, and they come in very handy. The arrow
On
key
disc 2 or
moves
volume
around
2?
a screen pixel at a
I think
time.
disc.
Over on the numeric keypad, the plus and minus keys,
I think
rotate
disc
a
is
layer
easier to say.
clockwise or counterclockwise,
But I
a
gotta.
degree at a time. And Alt plus or minus on the numeric
Whoa!
keypad scales the layer up
$90.
or back down a percentage point at a time. Now add the Shift key to any of these
Okay,
tools,
are they gonna.
and you multiply them by 10.
Does it say all of the.
Shift arrow keys move things 10
That's how it's
screen pixels
used.
at a time. Shift plus and minus, and you
First 2,
rotate
3 is on the way, and that's it.
Shift Alt plus or
Mr.
minus,
Head.
you scale up
50%
down
gray guard
10
dog.
percent at a time. Now, hardly anyone I know
Come on.
uses these plus and minus keys on the numeric keypad, but they're a good time saver when you're quickly laying things out, and I recommend
Don
you
Hertz
try to use them
belts.
when you can. Now, you may have noticed by now that things
Billy's
tend to rotate
balloon.
and scale
No, there's
around this little circle with the X thingy. Here in the
1
layer.
and 2
Click on our tool
pieces.
That's known as the anchor point. Sometimes you don't want the anchor point to be in the middle of an object. You want it to scale around some other
I guess
point.
I gotta go.
That's what this tool is good for. This is the anchor point tool, or the pan behind tool if you're using it in the mask window. But the anchor point tool lets you move the anchor point to a different position in a composition. And once it's there, when you scale,
Okay, is this gonna have.
the layer scales around that point.
Is this gonna show where they all are?
The layer rotates around that point. Sometimes
Do
you'll
I
need
have to-
get a little closer to your work. You have a
Yeah,
variety
I
of
can just
options
get it
to
out of
zoom
my.
in and out of a comp. First, there's the zoom tool right here, which zooms in wherever you click it. Alt click and you zoom back out again. Now, it's often quicker, instead of using the zoom tool, to use one of many keyboard shortcuts. Now, the same shortcut from Photoshop works here, and that's Control plus and minus up there at the top of the keyboard, not the one over on the numeric keypad. But Control plus and minus can be problematic. Control minus is okay, you shrink the window. But note that the whole window shrinks
is it?
to snap it down to the size of the layer. And while Control
Do I have it
plus
still
makes the
out
window
here?
grow, and for too long, the window will take over your entire screen, and you won't be able to get into your other windows. So personally, I find a
I
different
don't
keyboard shortcut.
see it.
And that's the period and the comma keys. Or if you'll look at the little symbols directly above the period and the comma, you've got a little left-hand arrow there and a little right-hand arrow. Well, that zooms in and zooms out of the layer without resizing the window. It's not control period or control comma. It's just period or comma. One key, the layer window stays the same size, and things stay manageable. Now, in addition to those choices, you can also select any of a variety of zoom ratios from the pop-up here. In the bottom left corner. Once again, this pop-up doesn't
Okay.
resize the window.
I think.
Before Before we move on, you can stop the tape if you like and practice adding and moving elements around. And
Okay, I
setting
think
some
it's
resolution settings. We'll continue working with this
done.
project as it looks now, though, so you may want to save a
Hertzfeld.
copy of it before you play with it too much. When you're ready to move on,
Yeah,
load
he's
up your save
so
file and start
hipsterish.
playing again. If you're ready to continue
It's such
now,
a beautiful
move on to the next
day.
section.
Or is it I'm so proud of you?
Alright, with our generic project loaded up where you left it off, let's take a
Or
closer
the-
look at the timeline. Bear with me, we'll start
I think it's
animating
this
things
one.
just a bit, but you need
On the way to the bus stop, Bill saw somebody he recognized walking towards him, but he couldn't remember his name. He began to think of things to say when they'd be close enough to acknowledge each other. As they drew nearer, their eyes locked, uncertain if the other was gonna stop to talk. The person greeted Bill, as Bill mixed up the phrases, "What's up?" with "How's it going?" Confused, the person blurted out, "Thanks," before he knew what he was saying. Words caught in Bill's throat, and he replied, "Way." They did a sorta awkward half-turn, and then continued on, now confident that the other was not going to stop to talk. They never saw each other again, and a day later had each forgotten the whole thing. Later that night, Bill sat down and put on a big sweater, but it only made him sleepy. In the supermarket, Bill was always very careful to select fruit from only the back of the produce piles, as the fruit in the front was at crotch level to the other customers. An old man who smelled of gasoline held up an onion and said, "Big onion," to no one in particular. He smiled at Bill, and Bill looked at his socks. At the checkout counter, Bill found himself behind a big guy whose t-shirt read, "Second place is the first loser." The checkout girl said, "How are you doing today?" Bill said, "Fine, thanks. How are you?" She didn't answer.
Bill felt used.
As he waited for his next bus, Bill stared at a torn shopping bag.
Okay, so once again, I have it on my laptop, sadly. But it's, I'm gonna say, man. Let's get rid of. Okay, man said. I gotta find it here. Or maybe, is it? Let's see. Okay. Let me. The person here. Is it here? It's gotta be one of these things. Yeah, it's. I try to do his voice, but it's. She smelled of freshly cracked pepper and spearmint. And then a few seconds later, it says she was perfect. But I think I wrote a funnier one. I think that works, though. She smells of freshly cracked pepper and spearmint. What was freshly cracked pepper and cardboard? I don't know. Spearmint or cardboard? I'm just doing it right now quickly on my laptop. I'll continue this. Okay, and so I'm
to be your best friend if you want to be productive in
putting on DaVinci Resolve, the
Thingy
text
at the top
box,
marks the current time.
and
A glance at that can tell you
she
exactly
was
where you
perfect.
are in a composition. You can clearly drag it around. If you
Which she
drag it, it'll
was.
attempt to update the window as quickly as it can.
I think a lot of people would
Notice as
like
we're dragging things around,
women who smelled of
time code
freshly
over on the left
cracked
changes
pepper.
to tell you exactly what frame you're on. Now, if you want to jump exactly to a particular time, you can just
Okay, she was
work
perfect.
here
I
and
put it
drag.
there, and then
Don't feel like dragging a great distance.
I
you can
want
just
to
click, or you can click
keep
on the
this
time code.
the freshly cracked pepper.
Enter in a new time. Periods work just fine. And you jump right to whatever you want.
Me
There's also a
She
timeline window, or a time code
smelled
window rather, at
of
the bottom of the comp window.
freshly
That brings up the
cracked
go-to window, and it
pepper
works just fine there as well.
and wet
If you
cardboard.
don't want to click in either of those places, but you like
She
to
smelled
go
of
to
freshly
command,
cracked
hit Control
pepper
T,
and
it brings it right up. Now, if you want to use keyboard shortcuts to move around in time,
do I have it anywhere
keys
else?
directly above the arrows on your keyboard are the ones you want to use.
Let's see.
Page up and page down takes you
A lot of this I
backwards
gotta
and forwards
just organize
one
my
frame at a time.
notes.
The home key takes you to the beginning of the composition. The end
She-
key takes you to the end of the composition. Now, shift page up and page down take you back.
I
and
think
forth
she
10
smelled
frames at a
of
time.
freshly cracked pepper and wet
Because I wanna be
cardboard.
thorough, I also want to point out that the control left and right arrows duplicate the same commands as the page up, page down. And of course,
You think
shift,
so?
control,
I don't
left
know
arrow,
if anybody's watching, of course,
do the same thing, only 10 frames.
but spearmint
Now, whether
or
you drag
cardboard.
or whether you use the arrow keys, if you move one frame off the end of the comp, things go blank, but you can still set keyframes there. Now, this is so you can set up
Spearmint.
movable animations. I'll demonstrate that a little bit later in the tape.
Wet.
But the last
Cardboard.
visible frame of your composition is actually one frame before the last frame you can drag to, hitting the home key. There's a little arrow to the left of the Neat Stuff layer. Click it. It twirls down and reveals two labels, Mask and Geometrics. Twirl down the one next to Geometrics, and you reveal 5 geometric properties: anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Now, to the right of each property under the time marker is a little I-beam. The I-beam tells you that the value of this property is constant, not animated. To the left of each property is a little stopwatch icon. If you click a stopwatch next to position, a little diamond-shaped icon appears over here. This is a keyframe. Now, to make a little more room on my screen here, I'm going to make my comp take up less room by hitting Control minus at the top of the keyboard to shrink down the comp window. Now, if you don't need to make room, you don't need to do this. But I'm going to drag the Neat Stuff picked to the upper left-hand corner of the composition, somewhere around here. This is going to be the starting point of our animation. In the timeline, move the timeline marker to 2 seconds and drag the picked file to here. As you drag it, you see this dotted line connecting the starting point with the current position that we're setting. And as soon as we release it, a new keyframe appears in the timeline down here. Now, once you've set a layer to animate, just changing a property at a new point on the timeline will set a keyframe. Hit the end key above the arrows. That takes us to the last visible frame of the animation. And now drag the layer here. You'll see the dotted line curves smoothly through the center point, and another keyframe will appear in the timeline. You have just made an animation. Let's preview the results. Now, make sure the layer that you want to preview is selected. It should be. And tap the 0 key on the numeric keypad. Just take a second to calculate, and then a little wireframe preview will appear and show you your motion in real time. It'll continue to cycle through the work area until you hit a key again. Cool, huh? Now, as long as the layer is selected, you can see the motion path in the, like, well, let's have some fun. We'll twist it around. Make it look something like this. Okay. Now preview the animation again. Remember, that's the 0 key on the numeric keypad. And you can see that our layer now follows the new path, just as we drew it. Okay, let's animate some other properties. Let's enable animation for scale by clicking on the little stopwatch. Now that sets a keyframe for scale where we left the timeline last, which was at the end of the animation. The value that it set was 100%, because that's the default value, because we haven't changed the scale of the thing yet. So that's fine. Let's move our timeline back to the beginning of the animation and change this value by clicking on it and entering a new value, let's say 0. Preserve frame aspect ratio is checked, so changing a value in one box affects the other box with the exact same value. We accept that, and now it's at 0% scale at the beginning of the animation. At the end of the animation, it's at 100%. So if we preview our animation now, as it follows the path that we drew, it should also scale up from 0 to 100%. And it does. Now, notice that the keyframes for scale and for position are independent of each other. Our position properties has 3 keyframes, whereas our scale property only has 2. All animation channels operate independently of each other in After Effects. We're free to click and drag our scale 100% value to anywhere that we want. It just means it'll get to 100% quicker, but it doesn't in any way change the path. Let's preview that. Now it gets to 100% a little bit quicker before its motion is finished. We can move that back. Okay, now I've resized our window a little bit here so we can see things a little more clearly. Got rid of the info window to give ourselves a little more room so you can see things better. Let's animate another property. Let's animate rotation this time. Now the default value for scale, you'll remember, was 100%. Well, the default value for rotation is 0 degrees because we haven't rotated anything yet. So we're going to set a keyframe and start animating rotation. There's the keyframe. It starts at 0 degrees. If we move to the last frame and click this little box here, we'll add another keyframe without changing the value. This can sometimes be very valuable. Right now we've got 2 keyframes, but there isn't anything happening between the 2. And the reason we set 2 like this is because now we want to move in between the 2 and change the value. That means it'll now start at 0 degrees, animate to whatever we change it to now, and then go back to 0 again. We've saved ourselves a couple of mouse clips by not having to add the 3rd keyframe and change the value back. We click the little underlined value here, and we add 1 revolution and say 270 degrees. Okay, note that the keyframe was added exactly where the blue time marker is. Keyframes are always added wherever the time marker is. Let's preview our animation. Okay. We've created a nice little entrance for neat stuff. It would be nice if it sort of held on screen at the end instead of just abruptly ended. So let's add a second to the end of our animation here. You can hit Control-K or click on the first try name here to bring up the composition settings. We'll change our duration to 5 seconds. Hit Return. Now, the timeline window has changed a little bit down here. We're still looking at the same amount of time that we were before, 4 seconds. Because even when you change the time, it keeps things zoomed to the same resolution. But the appearance of that little gray area up there tells us that there's some extra time in our composition. And if you click on the little handle and drag it out, we reveal the extra time. Sure enough, there is another second. Our keyframes have all stayed where we set them in time, but now we have an extra second of space to play with at the end of our animation. If we had wanted to, we could have also zoomed out by hitting the little zoom out key here on the right side of the window. Okay, now let's see what our preview looks like. Look at the distance, it's neat stuff. It flies in, it bounces off the wall, it falls down into place, and it looks much better as it holds for a second there at the end. Now, our animation is still a little bit robotic. It's a little bit abrupt. After Effects gives us a lot of little tools to smooth things out and make things look a lot more natural, for want of a better word. If in the real world neat stuff was flying around, it would look a little different from this. A useful tool in a case like this is the ability to smooth out keyframes. Now, if you notice, the keyframes are all shaped like little diamonds now. Well, this is telling us that these are linear keyframes. The values are changing from one to another in a perfectly straight line. If we select these last two keyframes, say, for rotation, and you can do that by marqueing around both of them, under the Layer menu, there's a sub-menu called Keyframe Assistance, and the first one that you come to is Easy Ease. If you pick that, the shape of our keyframes will change from the diamond to a little dumbbell shape. And that's telling us that we now have a Bezier curve in our velocity curve going through these keyframes, and the motion will now be smooth through these two rotation keyframes rather than abruptly changing from value to value. Let's see what that looks like so you'll see what I mean. If we preview the animation again with the 0 key on the keypad, and you'll see the rotation smooths in there and smooths into the last position. Looks a lot more natural. Smoothing keyframes is one of the main tips for making your motion seem more natural in After Effects. Another tip, if you can spare the rendering time and if you like the look of things, is enabling motion blur for an object. Down here in the timeline, there's a bunch of little switches, little icons to the right of the name of your layer. We'll discuss these in detail shortly, but right now, up above them, you'll see a button that says Enable Motion Blur. If you turn that on, which enables motion blur for the entire composition, and then enable motion blur for the layer by clicking the box under the letter M. And if you look at the results up in your timeline now, turning on motion blur generates an actual geometric motion blur for the object as it flies through space. If we move our timeline around, you can see that as our layer spins around and tumbles around and moves, it's actually generating a true motion blur. This can really add a lot of realism to a comm. If you have a fast enough processor, we're running on 132 megahertz 9500 right now, so this isn't all that speedy, but if you hit the space bar, After Effects still does a pretty good job of generating this motion blur quickly. Very cool. You notice as it comes to a rest at the end, it's not moving anymore, so the blur goes away. Now would be a great time to actually output a movie so you can preview what this all looks like at full speed. Go up to the Composition menu and select Make Movie, or the keyboard shortcut for that is Control-M. Let's save it to our desktop so we can find it quickly. And accept the name that it gives you, First Try Movie. This brings up the Render Queue window. Now, the Render Queue is a really terrific thing. There's nothing as well implemented as this in any other program I've found. I love this window. Right now, though, all we're going to pay attention to is these little pop-ups down here. Our render settings will switch to Best, because we want all of our wonderful things like motion blur to render out at best quality. We'll keep the output module at lossless, and we'll click Render. A little progress bar starts moving across the render queue. It tells us how much time has elapsed. Tells you exactly where you are in the animation. And gives you an estimated remaining time for when the movie is going to be done. When After Effects finishes, it rewards you with a little magic bell sound. And let's play it and see what it Very cool, huh? Great clouds, courtesy of Colorado Altitudes. All right, so that wasn't exactly a Spielberg film, but you're learning. This would actually be a great time to practice some of the things that we've covered. So go down to the timeline window, turn on the visibility of the action layer, and let's animate it doing the same move that the neat stuff layer did, except that the action movie will fly in from the bottom right, spin around on the left, and end up at the top, as if they were sort of dancing around each other. The final results should look something like this. Okay? Consider this your storyboard. There are a few things to avoid when working with keyframes, and if I point them out to you now, maybe it'll save you a few pitfalls along the way. If your animation, once you start putting this project together, just isn't working out the way you expected it, then look at your keyframes. The first thing you need to know is that if you don't have two keyframes, you don't have any animation. You have to have two keyframes at least, and the values in the keyframes have to be different, or you won't have any animation. Animation is a change between values. So if a property isn't animating, the first thing to check is to make sure that you have two keyframes. If you do have two keyframes and nothing's happening, then what's probably happening is that both keyframes are set to the same value. So check each keyframe and make sure that the values are what you expect. Now, the timeline, as you move it around, will give you feedback in the boxes over here as to what's going on between the keyframes. It tells you exactly what the value is wherever the time marker is in the timeline. The boxes don't tell you what the value is in a highlighted keyframe unless the keyframe is underneath the time marker. It's a common mistake for people to select a keyframe, change a value in the box without moving the blue timelight marker over. But what that does instead, say we change it to 50, is it adds a new keyframe where you are. It doesn't change the value of the keyframe that you had highlighted. Now, we haven't talked much about these boxes right here. They're all empty right now, and what that's telling us is that there's no keyframe where we are right now. This is true. If we move to the middle, you'll see that there's a keyframe here for position, which there is. There's a keyframe here for rotation, which there is. And there's no keyframe at scale, so the box is empty. The arrows to the right and the left of the box give us a quick way to navigate from keyframe to keyframe. Clicking the right arrow will take us to the first keyframe to the right of wherever we are. It's the last keyframe, so there isn't a right arrow there anymore. We click the left arrows, it takes us to the previous keyframe. And just play with these switches and make sure that you understand how to navigate around with them. Now, if you want to add a keyframe somewhere, you can do it just by clicking in the box here. But if you're planning on adding a keyframe and changing the values, you might as well just modify the values. The keyframe will add itself. You can force a keyframe with this box, and sometimes you want to do that. For instance, the way we did it early, where we wanted to set two keyframes with the same value, that's a quick way to do it. But generally speaking, you want to set keyframes by changing values, not by clicking in this box here. Now, one reason for that is if you get in the habit of adding keyframes by clicking in the box here, it's easy, particularly when you're starting out, to forget and accidentally click on the watch over here instead of clicking on the box. And if you click on the watch to add a keyframe, you're turning off the animation for that property and all of your keyframes go away. Fortunately, if you hit Control-Z or if you pick Undo from the Edit menu, you can bring those keyframes back. Now, there's a couple of different ways to delete a keyframe. You can move the little box on top of a keyframe and click the X, and then that keyframe will go away. We'll undo that, but it's much easier to just click on the keyframe itself to highlight it and hit the Delete key. Has the same effect. We'll undo that again. What makes that better is if you get used to it, you can select more than one keyframe at a time. If you shift-click on keyframes, you can select as many as you would like in any order that you would like and delete them. We'll undo that again. Or if you like, once they're selected, you can click and drag and move them around in the timeline as a connected bunch of keyframes. This is a great way to adjust where groups of keyframes need to occur in an animation. You can also, once you've selected keyframes, which you can again do by just clicking on them, by shift-clicking to add, or by drawing this little marquee box by clicking and dragging around the keyframes that you want to grab. Or if you want to select all of the keyframes in a property, click on the name of that property, and boom, it'll select all of the keyframes for that property. This is very useful, particularly when you get into something like motion math, which generates a bazillion keyframes, or when you're working on a really long project and you have a wide window and a lot of keyframes to select. Just clicking on the name selects all the keyframes for that property. Now, once they're selected, you can copy and paste keyframes just as if you were in a word processor. If you select all of the keyframes for position and copy with Control-C, select the action layer, and hit Control-V to paste them, well, it pastes the keyframes back in. But notice that it pastes them starting wherever you are in the timeline. We selected keyframes that began at time 0. There was another one at 2 and another one at 4. But because our timeline marker was at 2, when we pasted them back in, the first keyframe came in at 2. The keyframe that was in 2 was now at 4, and the one that was in 4 is now off of the timeline over at 6. We don't want to do that, so we want to move back to 0 and paste. And our action clip will now be animated with the same position values as the Neat Stuff Picked was. So that's a little hint for how you might get some values for this next project. And one more thing that I want to point out to you before we let you try your exercise, I want to talk about how they behave when you delete a bunch of them. Let's select all of the keyframes for position. Notice our time marker is set at 2 seconds. Now remember, our first keyframe for position started up in the upper left, our second keyframe moved off to the right, and our last keyframe centered itself at the bottom of the comp. Now if we just hit delete, hit the delete key, notice that Neat Stuff popped up to its initial position. So when you delete a bunch of keyframes with the delete key, the default position becomes whatever the first keyframe was. Just so you know. However, we'll undo that if we're in the same setup that we had before, 3 keyframes, and our timeline is still at 2 seconds.
Yeah, sorry guys, it's all
Deleting the keys with the delete
busy.
key, we simply
We're gonna
turn
call
off
it.
the animatability of the
This is
layer
just a weird
by
stream.
clicking on the stopwatch.
Okay?
When all the
Okay, I'm
keyframes
sorry
go away
here.
and the default
Have a good
value
night.
for the layer is set itself
We'll slowly start to figure more
value
things
that's
out.
underneath the
All
focus
right?
point in the timeline.
Take care here.